The entire afternoon was a blur of mental choreography for Evelyn Markham. She directed and redirected the scene in the theater of her mind, projecting onto the screen of her thoughts the precise moment of revelation on Daniel's face, the instant when the weight of a decade of unspoken prayers would finally land in his eyes. It was a gift she had fought to give him for 10 agonizingly long years. The confirmation itself had arrived that morning with a profound lack of ceremony, a quiet, clinical verdict that felt almost alien in its simplicity. 4 weeks pregnant, a fragile sequence of words, a phrase she had long ago exiled from her vocabulary of hope. It was the ceasefire after a decade of clinical warfare. The treatments, the sterile sting of injections, the endless consultations, and the insidious, slow erosion of her spirit that accompanied every single failed attempt. She'd clutched the paper, the physical proof of this new reality, letting the minutes stretch into an eternity in her silent kitchen, her gaze locked on the faint printed lines, half expecting them to be a cruel mirage. A single, hard blink, she feared, might be enough to shatter the illusion, but the lines held. They remained, defiant and unwavering, a solid, undeniable truth that was already rewriting her entire world. Life-changing. And for a truth this monumental, the reveal had to be perfect. It needed to be a moment of pure, unadulterated triumph, a memory powerful enough to eclipse the long shadow of heartbreak that had stretched across the landscape of their marriage. And Daniel, lost in his own world, had unwittingly provided the perfect backdrop. His mind was completely consumed by his company's approaching celebration, a grand affair set for the opulent Palmer House Hilton. For weeks, it was all he could speak of, a constant monologue of logistics and expectations, an obsession with every minute detail that, to Evelyn, felt like a divine signal. It was the perfect stage. It was already fancy, dramatic, and undeniably grand. It was a setting where a life-altering surprise, a secret miracle, could feel like a stroke of destiny rather than a carefully staged performance. In the quiet intimacy of their bedroom, Evelyn confronted her reflection, a stranger staring back from the mirror. Her hands moved with a detached precision, smoothing the crisp, impersonal fabric of the black catering uniform she'd acquired for this single, monumental purpose. This wasn't a costume for a party. It was camouflage for a battlefield. It offered no glamour, only the profound power of anonymity she so desperately craved. The thought of Daniel's eyes finding her, recognizing her before the moment was right, sent a tremor of ice through her veins. A premature discovery would mean the collapse of this fragile, terrifying plan. With practiced control, she swept her hair into a severe, low bun, a gesture of erasing her own identity. A whisper of makeup masked her features, and the envelope, the heart of the entire operation, found its cold, stiff home in the inner pocket of her blazer. Her fingers brushed against it, a fleeting touch to confirm its weight, its terrible reality. It was there, it was real. The decision had been made. Her own voice was a ghost in the room, a hushed promise to the woman in the glass. Tonight, she breathed, the truth will finally have its say. Stepping into the Palmer House Hilton was like entering another world, a gilded cage of success. The lobby was a symphony of golden light, a warm, deceptive glow that danced across the breathtaking murals on the historic ceiling. A river of guests flowed around her, men and women clad in shimmering evening gowns and impeccably tailored suits, their armor for the night. They moved with an easy confidence, a self-assurance forged over years of navigating the cutthroat currents of Chicago's corporate world. Evelyn felt like a phantom among them, a secret walking in plain sight. She kept her gaze lowered, a deliberate act of self-effacement, and followed the invisible line that led not to the grand entrance, but to the discreet service door. Here, the true machinery of the evening was in motion, a blur of staff, emerging with gleaming trays of champagne and meticulously crafted hors d'oeuvres. In this world of purposeful motion, her own purpose went entirely unnoticed. Not a single glance lingered on her. She was just another uniform, another shadow. A wave of profound, chilling relief washed over her. This was the invisibility she needed. Beyond the doors, inside the grand ballroom, the celebration's pulse was already a low, steady thrum of jazz. A gentle melody wove its way through the room, a delicate thread in the tapestry of sound. It hung just above the muted hum of voices, a symphony of polite conversation. Here, Connections were forged over laughter, and glasses were raised in tribute, celebrating yet another victory for the formidable Markham and Cubar advertising. The ambience was meticulously crafted. The lighting, a warm golden wash, was designed to flatter, to make every shadowed corner of the grand hall feel intimate and alive. It was a perfect illusion of ease, but as Evelyn paused by a marble pillar, a different reality began to dawn. Her gaze swept across the sea of faces, a silent, searching question in her eyes. She was looking for one person, for the reassuring anchor of Daniel's presence, and then she found him, positioned near the room's vibrant heart, yet somehow utterly separate from it. He was, as ever, a portrait of perfection. The suit he wore, a deep charcoal grey tailored to his form, was less a choice of fashion and more a carefully constructed armor of quiet authority. It was a familiar sight, yet tonight something was fundamentally wrong with the picture. A dissonance she could feel in the pit of her stomach. The Daniel she knew thrived in these moments, but this man wasn't mingling with his usual effortless grace. That magnetic charm, the one that drew people in, was conspicuously absent. There was no genuine laughter crinkling the corners of his eyes, no deep, engaging conversations with the clients and colleagues who orbited him. Instead, he was a statue amidst the flow, a man holding a drink, but whose mind was clearly elsewhere, his gaze locked with an unnerving intensity on the grand archway of the ballroom entrance. An icy knot formed in Evelyn's chest. He looked hunted. A palpable tension radiated from him, the posture of a man bracing for an impact, waiting for a ghost to walk through that door, a ghost that was clearly not her. She saw his fingers, a frantic, silent rhythm tapping against the cool surface of his glass, a telltale sign, a nervous habit reserved only for moments of profound anxiety. And she watched, her breath catching, as with every new arrival that crossed the threshold, every silhouette that appeared in the doorway, his entire body would tense with a flicker of hope, or perhaps dread, before visibly deflating once more. Back, a subtle shift in his features that spoke not of joy, but of something else, disappointment. It was a fleeting shadow, but she saw it, and her mind scrambled to erase the image. A knot of unease tightened in her stomach. It had to be the stress, she told herself, the relentless pressure from his work. He'd been consumed by it lately, a ghost in their own home, his mind always elsewhere. The company's expansion was a voracious beast, and he was at the heart of it, chasing a pivotal partnership that had haunted their conversations for months. An investor, she reasoned. He must be waiting for a crucial investor to arrive. Or maybe a senior colleague. Anything, any plausible explanation was better than the cold whisper of her intuition. Perhaps she was the one at fault, letting her own anxieties paint the scene in darker colors. She was nervous, emotional, her body chemistry in flux. She desperately needed to be wrong. The need for this moment to be perfect was a physical ache. With a deep breath, Evelyn began to move, a phantom in her server's uniform, gliding through the crowded room. She lifted an empty tray, a prop to legitimize her slow, deliberate approach, a shield for her true purpose. The performance of working was all that mattered now. She had to close the distance. She needed to get near enough to slip the small white envelope onto his table, a silent offering next to his glass of champagne, a secret waiting to be found. The discovery had to feel like serendipity, a magical moment, not a planned maneuver. It couldn't carry a hint of suspicion. Her heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic drumbeat, playing a rhythm of pure elation and gut-wrenching doubt. But she pushed the fear down. She was propelled forward by the vision of his face when he understood, a moment she was determined to give him. Just then, Daniel's eyes darted back to the restaurant's entrance. Again. And with that one, repeated gesture, a crack appeared in the foundation of her perfect evening. Evelyn's hope, once a brilliant flame, sputtered violently. Her hand instinctively clutched the envelope hidden in her jacket, the paper suddenly feeling like a lead weight against her ribs, heavy with unspoken words. This was a promise, a miracle held in a paper fold, the culmination of a wish she had nurtured in the quietest parts of her soul for so long. She had to remind herself, clinging to the thought like a lifeline, that tonight was a celebration. This was supposed to be the beginning of a story they would tell for the rest of their lives, a memory they would polish until it shone, but his eyes were on the door, and she was invisible. As her gaze remained fixed on Daniel's ceaseless search, his eyes sweeping the entryway with a peculiar, almost frantic energy, a delicate thread of dread, unwelcome and cold, began to weave itself through the fabric of her joyful anticipation. In her heart, a fragile hope and a heavy premonition now sat in a tense, silent truce, and so Evelyn, her true self hidden behind a servant's facade, pushed herself further into the glittering expanse of the ballroom, moving toward a man who was, in that moment, becoming a stranger to her. She was meticulously arranging the champagne flutes on her tray, a small grounding task, when the grand doors of the ballroom swung open once more, breathing a gust of noticeably colder air from the hall into the warm, crowded room. A few idle heads turned, their curiosity piqued for only a moment, but it was the shift in Daniel's entire being that sent a shockwave through her, arresting her movements and her breath in a single, painful instant. His body, which had been coiled with a nervous tension, suddenly became charged, a current of pure focus running through him as his gaze found and locked onto the new arrival with an unnerving intensity. A young woman, appearing no older than 24, glided over the threshold, wrapped in an aura of casual authority, the kind of self-possession that is not learned but inherited, nurtured over a lifetime of being the center of every room she entered. Her gown was a cascade of liquid light under the chandeliers, a whisper of silver satin that didn't just hang on her frame, but seemed to have been spun from moonlight and draped perfectly upon her. Her hair fell around her shoulders in what looked like careless waves, yet Evelyn knew instinctively that such artful dishevelment was the expensive result of both premium treatments and the masterful hands of a stylist paid to create an illusion of effortlessness. Every movement she made was fluid, imbued with an unspoken certainty, the quiet elegance of a person who had never known a world that didn't bend to her will. A woman whose life was a portrait of privilege, gracing the openings of elite schools and captured in the flashbulb glare of charity galas. She carried an aura of someone utterly at ease in rooms where her reputation always arrived before she did, a space where everyone already knew the weight and power behind her name, Ava Kensington. For Evelyn, the recognition was a sickening lurch, a sudden, cold clarity. The woman materialized, plucked directly from the glossy magazine articles Daniel had so casually shown her months prior, a time that now felt like a different, more naive era. He had framed it all as just a possibility, a whisper of a future deal, a strategic collaboration with the formidable Kensington family. Back then, in the safety of their office, it had felt like a thrilling professional challenge. Just business, he'd said, a major dynasty in the cutthroat world of Chicago real estate. He'd even sold it as her potential victory, saying Eve, landing them, could redefine everything for our agency. And a part of her believed him, but the story he told had a specific protagonist, Harrison. Kensington, the unapproachable billionaire patriarch, a distant and powerful figure. He had never, not even once, breathed a word about the daughter. The omission was a gaping hole in the narrative, and here she was, the living proof of his secret. In that instant, the man Evelyn knew fractured, his entire composure shifting as if her mere appearance had flicked a hidden switch inside him. He reached for his drink without a glance, his hand fumbling, nearly tipping the glass, as his body was pulled toward her by an invisible, undeniable force. It was an eagerness so raw, so completely unguarded, it felt like a public betrayal. Then came the smile, a brilliant, dazzling expression that Evelyn realized, with a pang of ice in her chest, she hadn't seen aimed in her direction for agonizingly long months. It bloomed across his face with a devastating effortlessness that made the air in her own lungs feel thin and her stomach clench into a tight, painful knot. There was no hesitation, no flicker of professional restraint in his eyes. He shattered the unspoken boundary of a businesslike decorum. Instead of a polite greeting, he reached for her, closing the distance, his hand landing on the delicate curve of Ava's lower back with a practiced, possessive familiarity. It was a gesture that screamed of a shared history, a silent language Evelyn couldn't decipher, and Ava beamed up at him, a specific, radiant light in her eyes, while her hand rested on his forearm with a pressure that lingered just beyond professional courtesy. In response, A silent, crushing force coiled around Evelyn's fingers, tightening them on the fragile stem of a champagne flute she'd been mindlessly polishing. A battle raged within her. She fought the impulse to stare, to let the catastrophic scenarios her mind was constructing take over, but the tableau playing out just feet away was a truth too stark to ignore. A performance, too intimate, too flawlessly choreographed. This was not the awkwardness of two strangers networking at a company gala. This was the profound, unspoken language of two souls, who knew one another's histories, comforts, and private spaces. She had to break the spell. She commanded her limbs to obey, lifting the heavy silver tray and melting back into the orchestrated chaos of servers navigating the opulent ballroom. With calculated steps, she began a slow orbit toward their corner of the room, her uniform a cloak of invisibility amidst the tector, other staff. As the distance closed, the gentle murmur of the party's background noise sharpened, and certain words began to crystallize, each one stealing a little more of the air from her lungs. You have to admit, one woman's voice slid into her hearing, a conspiratorial whisper to her friend, "They look absolutely perfect together." "Oh, everyone in the office sees it," the other confirmed with a knowing sigh. "It's been the unofficial story for months." A violent, sickening jolt slammed through Evelyn's chest, her heart a frantic drum against her ribs. The tray in her hands began to vibrate with the tremor running through her, forcing her to halt, to anchor herself for a brief, desperate moment, gasping for a breath that wouldn't come. She tried to rewind the moment, to rehear those words, praying they were a cruel trick of her own insecurity, misheard them, but the whispers slithered back, a serpent of sound coiling in the air. They persisted, their carelessness a unique form of cruelty, spoken with the casual confidence of an accepted truth. Her gaze, against her better judgment, risked another glance, a self-destructive pull toward the source of her dread, Daniel and Ava. The space between them was a violation, an intimate bubble Evelyn could never penetrate. Daniel leaned in, his head dipping down as if sharing a universe contained in a single breath, a secret that bloomed into a laugh from Ava, a sound so soft, so private, it felt like an overheard confession. She instinctively covered her mouth, a gesture of shared intimacy, as he reached out and brushed a stray wisp of her dark hair from her face, tucking it gently behind her shoulder. For a fleeting moment, his fingers made contact with her skin, a feather-light touch that screamed a familiarity far beyond the boundaries of professional courtesy. In response, Ava tilted her head, her body language an open invitation, her own words, murmured so low they seemed to physically alter him, melting the tension in his shoulders, coaxing a look of unguarded warmth, of a tenderness that was almost painful to witness. It was the very tenderness Evelyn's heart had been starving for, a gentle gaze she hadn't received from him in years. A knot of ice formed in her throat, constricting her breath. The envelope tucked inside her jacket, once a symbol of hope, now felt like a lead weight, a dead secret she was unknowingly carrying, a relic from a life that might already be over. She was walking onto a battlefield, and she hadn't even known there was a war. A morbid curiosity propelled her forward, a need to hear the verdict on her own life. She drifted closer, just enough to catch the poisoned fragments of gossip drifting from the orbit of Daniel's own work friends. The jury she never knew had been assembled. "They're practically joined at the hip these days," one voice murmured, laced with knowing amusement. "She's the reason his head has been in the clouds for months," another added. "Her parents absolutely love him, you know. They think he's the real deal." Then came the question, the one that made her invisible. "And Evelyn?" The question was answered not with words, but with the sound of a verbal shrug, a gesture of complete dismissal. "Oh, I think that. Marriage has been a ghost for a long, long time." The world tilted, the tray in her hands suddenly a foreign object, its weight almost slipping from her grasp. Her heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic bird trapped in a cage, as the air thinned around her. Her gaze locked onto the silhouette that had defined her world for more than a decade, the man whose existence was interwoven with her own. He held her heart, the blueprints of their shared future, and the last, most delicate, ember of her hope for motherhood. And this man, the very architect of her life, was now bathed in a glow of pure elation, a radiance she hadn't seen on his face, directed at her in years, a light now reserved for someone else. The realization forced a single step back, then another, a primal retreat from a truth too sharp to bear, letting her melt into the anonymous current of servers until she found the cold, hard safety of the ballroom's edge once more. Her server's uniform became her shield, a cloak of invisibility. No one could see the subtle collapse of her features, the way the life drained from her eyes, or the violent tremor that seized the corners of her mouth. The grand room began to tilt, a slow, nauseating carousel of laughter and light, the music swelling into a discordant roar, the chandeliers burning with the intensity of interrogators' lamps. Her heart began to pound a frantic, desperate rhythm, a wild bird trapped in her ribs, making it impossible to draw a simple, steadying breath. It wasn't a crack that had just appeared in the foundation of her marriage. It was a seismic fracture, a chasm opening right beneath her feet, and she could feel herself being pulled into the cold, dark void. A strange, icy resolve flooded Evelyn's veins. Her fingers tightened on the champagne tray, the cold metal, a grim anchor as she willed herself back toward the source of her world's implosion, Daniel and Ava's table. The weight of the crystal flutes felt utterly alien in her hands, as if they belonged to a different person, a different life. It was as though her own body had forgotten the muscle memory of a task once so mundane. But her feet kept moving, a puppet pulled by unseen strings of shock, forcing a steady, measured pace. She was driven by a terrible compulsion, a need to get closer, to see the truth with her own eyes, to make the agony real. She had to get closer, into the orbit of their words, close enough to finally understand, close enough to know if the venomous whispers that had haunted her for weeks were the cruel fictions of jealous minds, or if they were the brutal, shattering truth her own heart had so desperately tried to deny. There she saw Daniel. He and Ava had retreated to a secluded alcove, a self-imposed exile from the glittering sea of colleagues, carving out an intimate space in the sprawling ballroom. It was a world built for two, a universe where Evelyn had no place. With a breath she didn't realize she was holding, Evelyn moved toward them, adopting the practiced invisibility of the waitstaff, a ghost slipping through the living. The tray, in her hand, a flimsy shield, was held aloft as the murmur of their conversation reached her, a low, intimate tide. Yet, as she drew nearer, the gentle waves of sound crested and broke into shards of devastating clarity. "I promise, it won't be much longer now," Daniel was murmuring, his voice a velvet cloak over a cold blade. It was the sound of a carefully crafted lie meant to soothe. "The divorce," he continued. "The papers are already being drawn up. I'll be free soon." Free. The word wasn't spoken, it was detonated in the silent chamber of Evelyn's heart. It was a physical impact, a shard of ice, that pierced the fragile shell of her denial. Her feet froze to the floor. She was just behind them, close, enough to absorb every poisoned syllable, all while cloaked in the anonymity of her uniform. Then Ava leaned closer, her hand settling on his wrist, a gesture of ownership, a silent claim. "I trust you," she purred, her voice a soft counterpoint to the hard bargain that followed. "But my parents, they're serious. They won't sign anything, not until this is all resolved. So, it's official." Ava's voice was a silken thread of confirmation. "You know their particular ways. They insist on a clean break, a sterile corporate phrase for a deeply personal severance." "I know." Daniel's response was immediate, a well-rehearsed line delivered with chilling speed. "I've already assured them. I completely understand their position, their need to protect their own interests." He framed the end of a relationship as a mere clause in a contract. "And once that's all finalized," he continued, a subtle shift in his tone from business to anticipation, "we can move forward with the partnership and everything else." Everything else. The two words detonated silently in Evelyn's mind, vaporizing a future, a life she once believed was being built for them. Together. The air in Evelyn's lungs turned to shards of ice. Each breath, a painful, jagged thing lodged in her throat. A wave of vertigo washed over her, the opulent room tilting on its axis, as if the solid marble floor had liquefied beneath her feet, threatening to swallow her whole. She fought to keep her face a placid, empty mask, the practiced neutrality of a ghost in the room. But a silent war raged within her, a desperate struggle for composure. Her fingers, however, betrayed her, clenching the metal rim of the tray. With such force she felt the cold bite into her skin. She half expected the crystal glasses to shatter from the sheer pressure of her unspoken agony. Just then, a man approached their table, his face a familiar but nameless blur, a ghost from parties past. When she had stood by Daniel's side, not serving him, he raised his champagne flute, a broad, oblivious grin splitting his face. "A toast to the most dazzling couple of the evening," he declared, his voice a cheerful intrusion that sliced through the ambient music. Instantly, the others joined the chorus, their complicit laughter erupting around the table like a sudden, cruel applause. "To Daniel and Ava," they chanted, cementing the two names together. "You two are absolutely perfect together," someone shouted. "So you're finally making it official, eh?" A delicate blush colored Ava's cheeks, a masterful performance of coyness that couldn't quite hide the triumphant sparkle in her eyes as she absorbed the public validation. Daniel offered no denial. There was no correction, no flicker of hesitation that might honor the past. Instead, he made his choice. He slid an arm possessively around Ava's waist, pulling her flush against his side in a final, public declaration, as if the world had entered into a silent, collective agreement, one that validated the very secret he had so carefully shielded from Evelyn's reality. A glacial numbness crept through her as Evelyn began to back away, her movements slow, deliberate, a retreat designed to be invisible. She became a ghost, slipping between the bodies of other servers, her own form dissolving into the background noise of the party. She was drawn toward the far exit, a portal leading into a sterile service corridor. The instant the door swung shut behind her, the ballroom's vibrant pulse, its warmth and music, died. The sound was cut off with the finality of a guillotine, a severed lifeline. In the stark, narrow hallway, under the cold hum of fluorescent lights, flanked by metal racks and crisp, folded linens, Evelyn finally allowed her back to press against the unyielding wall. A violent tremor seized her legs, the very foundation of her body, threatening to collapse under the weight of this new, monstrous truth. The tray she was holding tilted, a precarious dance of crystal and liquid, and she managed to set it down on a nearby counter just before the delicate glasses could shatter, a sound that would have mirrored her own soul. A profound silence rushed in to fill the void, wrapping around her like a shroud. It was the kind of silence that felt alive, a heavy, suffocating presence that pulsed with everything she now knew. Her hand moved, almost an automaton, reaching into the inside pocket of her blazer to retrieve a folded piece of paper. It was the envelope, her miracle, her fragile, hard-won hope, the culmination of 10 years of quiet, desperate prayers, finally, mercifully answered. The pregnancy, confirmation, the joyful secret she had planned to reveal to him. Tonight, under the fairy tale glow of glittering chandeliers, with a celebratory glass of champagne raised in her hand, the paper trembled violently between her fingers, a leaf caught in a storm. Her eyes locked onto the printed words, a testament to a new beginning, held in the ruins of an ending. Lines, the clinical codes, the ethereal silhouette of a life just beginning a secret that was meant to be a bridge between them, offered with joyful tears. But now, holding the evidence of one future, while staring at the wreckage of another, she saw the chilling architecture of the life he was already building, a life where she was merely rubble from the past. In her hands, the paper ceased to be a promise and became an indictment, its meaning twisting into a shard of ice lodged deep within her chest. The child she carried would not be a testament to their love, but a monument to its demise. The marriage hadn't just ended. She now realized it had been a ghost for some time, A hand flew to her lips, a desperate, instinctual gesture to contain the tremor of a sound that broke free. It was a fragment of grief, too raw to be a sob, yet too full of agony, to be mistaken for mere silence. A hot pressure built behind her eyes, but she fought the tears back with a will of iron, refusing to grant them release here, in this sterile space, this anonymous corridor where the very walls seemed to exude the cold, chemical scent of detachment and finality. A flash of fire, a fantasy of confrontation, ignited in her mind. She could see herself marching back into that glittering ballroom, tearing the thin paper in two, and demanding he witness the life he was discarding. But, through the fog of shock, a terrible, piercing lucidity emerged, cutting through the rage with the precision of a surgeon's blade. Daniel wasn't struggling with his choice. He had already settled into it. He wasn't caught in a moment of hesitation. He wasn't a man conflicted. There was no battle being waged for his soul. He had already vacated their life, leaving only a physical shell behind, and she had just been the last to notice. And so Evelyn closed her eyes, letting the darkness steady her, her fingers folding the envelope with a slow, deliberate finality, and slid it back into the pocket of her jacket. She chose the weight of silence over the emptiness of his answers, a fragile truce with the storm inside her, at least for a moment. The cold, sterile service corridor became Evelyn's unlikely sanctuary, a place to force her lungs to obey, to quell the violent tremor, as the acidic burn of betrayal behind her eyes receded into a dull, throbbing ache. But the muffled hum of voices from the ballroom was a siren's call, a magnetic pull on the frayed edges of her resolve. She wasn't ready to go back. Confronting Daniel felt like a physical impossibility. Her heart was too fractured, her mind too splintered. All that remained was a primal, desperate need to understand. The question why became a frantic, hammering pulse in her temples. Why this chasm? Why had he wandered so far from the man she knew, the man she married? Why was he so willing to set a match to a decade of their shared existence? And why was he risking the entire architecture of their life for a woman who was a stark, painful reminder of a youth nearly 12 years her junior? A cold wave of determination washed over the grief. She smoothed her uniform, a flimsy armor, wiping the dampness from her palms, transforming from a wounded wife into an unseen observer. She moved with a ghost's silence, drawn back toward the doorway, the threshold of her pain. She stopped just where the two worlds met, a precipice of shadow and light, letting the darkness of the hallway bleed into the glittering warmth of the party, a perfect cloak of invisibility woven from neglect and preoccupation, hidden in plain sight, unnoticed. She held her breath and listened. Her gaze landed on a small circle of Daniel's colleagues, his professional family, gathered near the bar, their voices carrying the loose, unthinking confidence of people who operate with the blithe assumption that everyone within earshot is either an ally who shares their worldview or simply part of the scenery, too unimportant to matter. Evelyn's mind catalogued the familiar faces, art directors she'd hosted for dinner, account managers she'd exchanged pleasantries with, the senior strategists she knew by name. The sharp, bright sound of their laughter, punctuated by the chime of clinking glasses, reached her as they discussed Daniel and Ava, not in hushed tones, but with the kind of unfiltered, casual ease that sent a chill down her spine. A cold knot tightened deep inside her, a physical response to the words that drifted over. Well, a voice mused, he's finally breached the inner circle. The observation came from a man watching the amber liquid swirl in his glass, the ice clinking like a distant, hollow bell. Securing the Kensingtons. Now, that's not just a win, it's the masterstroke of his career. A gambit he's never dared before, the man continued, and having their daughter on his arm, is certainly the most valuable part of the deal. A ripple of sharp, knowing laughter passed through the group. A woman's voice, laced with cynical admiration, cut in. Ava's father holds the deed to practically half the Gold Coast in his back pocket. If Daniel orchestrates his next moves perfectly, she added, her tone analytical, Markham and Coa will cease to be a charming little agency and become the dominant, boutique media empire in this city, potentially far beyond it. Another man affirmed with a decisive, "Precisely. You have to understand, Harrison Kensington is more than just property. His influence is a web woven through the very fabric of this place. He has tendrils in media, a hand in politics, a name in philanthropy. And then there's his wife. Victoria's modeling agency dictates the faces you see on half of the country's major campaigns. If Daniel marries into that dynasty, the gates don't just open for him, they cease to exist." A low whistle cut through the chatter, a sound of pure, unadulterated awe. Now that is the ultimate ascension. Evelyn's heartbeat, which had been a frantic drum, suddenly slowed. It wasn't the peace of relief, but the glacial stillness of a terrible, dawning clarity. The fragmented pieces of the last few months clicked into place with horrifying precision. She had always known that Daniel was driven by a fierce ambition. She had understood his hunger to elevate his agency from its respectable, yet modest, success into something truly great. But the narrative she had cherished, the one she had helped write in her own mind, was that this ambition was forged from the noble fires of hard work, raw talent, and sheer force of will. She had held on to the belief that he wanted to build an empire from the ground up, brick by brick, with her hand in his. But now, in the chilling echo of their words, that entire, beautiful, fragile construction of a man she thought she knew simply disintegrated. This was never a story about love. This was never. It was never about a connection of the heart. It was about the cold, calculated forging of an alliance. Daniel, it became chillingly clear, was not falling in love. He was executing a strategic maneuver. A second voice joined the first, a conspiratorial whisper that sliced through the air. "Let's cut the pretense," he murmured. "We all know what this is really about. Ava Kensington is not some whirlwind romance that swept him off his feet." The voice dripped with a cynical admiration. "She is his golden key, the one that unlocks the gates to the Kensington Empire. We're talking about legacy wealth, untouchable power, the kind of influence that rewrites a man's entire destiny. To be with her is to be reborn into a higher echelon of existence. His old life ceases to matter. Her parents are completely charmed by him," the first man confirmed. "They see him as the future. They've already branded him their rising star, a perfect addition to their constellation. Victoria's practically curating his future, personally handing him a Rolodex of the city's elite from her own agency. They paraded him around, introduced him to at least half the major donors at that last ostentatious charity ball. And the father," the other added, his tone dropping to seal the point, "he's got a massive joint media venture on the table, a kingmaker of a project ready to be signed. But there's a condition. It only happens times after times the divorce is finalized. Think about it. They are a brand. They're not about to tarnish the Kensington name by linking it to a man still entangled in a messy, middle-class marriage. Especially, and here came the final, fatal blow, when his wife so clearly doesn't fit within their polished, rarefied circle." The phrase wasn't just a remark, it was a verdict, a silent, brutal punch to her soul. Her mind seized the words, playing them on a loop. "Doesn't fit their circle." The three words echoed in the sudden, vast emptiness inside her. Circles. Evelyn had never given a thought to the invisible lines that divided people. She had never craved the weight of old money or the subtle currency of social power that flowed like a ghost through the veins of Chicago's elite. The life she had painstakingly constructed with Daniel was built on a different foundation, one of shared dreams, mutual struggle, and the quiet, desperate hope that held them together through the grueling, soul-crushing marathon of 10 years of fertility treatments. But for him, she now understood with devastating clarity, all that shared history was merely the price of admission for this, was all irrelevant. In the cold, hard currency of his ambition, she had been devalued to nothing, a shortcut to high society. That was what he was purchasing. That was the world he was ascending to. And Ava Kensington, with her curated elegance, her luminous youth, her billionaire father, and a mother who presided over a modeling empire, was his all-access pass. The understanding didn't crash over Evelyn. It seeped into her bones slowly, painfully, settling not as the sharp sting of shock, but as a terrible, blinding clarity. A clarity that cauterized the wound as it opened it. Every piece of the puzzle clicked into its horrifying place. Daniel's calculated distance, the growing chill in his touch, the endless late nights, his sudden, ravenous hunger for a flawless image, for prestige, for relentless expansion. It all coalesced into a single, brutal narrative. He hadn't been drifting away by accident. He was climbing with a terrifying deliberateness, each step meticulously planned. And she no longer had a role in the grand production he envisioned for his life. The devastation inside her did not erupt. It collapsed inward, a silent implosion, growing quiet, heavy, and utterly unforgiving. Her hand moved on its own, a phantom gesture to her abdomen where a secret life was taking root. It was the first flicker of a fierce, protective instinct rising from the ashes of her love. The child she carried, a testament to a love he was now erasing, had no place in the gleaming, sterile world Daniel was constructing. And that truth, more than the affair, more than the lies, settled deep within her soul. A leaden weight she knew she could never dislodge. Daniel hadn't chosen a woman over her. He had chosen an institution, the Kensington Empire. And Evelyn, still rooted to the spot in the encroaching shadows, finally saw it all. The cold, hard clarity of the truth finally settled in her bones, a chilling awareness of just how completely she had been rendered invisible in his world. An oppressive quiet met Evelyn as she crossed the threshold, the apartment itself seeming to hold its breath, while she was still encased in the stiff fabric of her catering uniform beneath a heavy winter coat. Outside, the sprawling city lights of downtown Chicago pulsed through the panoramic windows, throwing shattered, elongated shadows across the polished hardwood floor. She remained frozen for a long moment, not just hearing the silence, but feeling it, a palpable presence far heavier than any exhaustion she had ever brought home with her. Daniel's name had flashed on her screen earlier, a perfunctory text announcing his lateness. It was a foregone conclusion. Of course he would be. In her mind's eye, she saw him, still holding court at the opulent Palmer House Hilton, bathing in the intoxicating glow of the Kensingtons, validation, buffing the perfect public image that he cherished, far more than the private reality of his marriage. Evelyn shrugged off the coat, her movements deliberate as she hung it neatly on. The rack, an almost robotic motion, the kind of detached precision a person employs when their mind builds a fortress, to hold back the initial, crushing wave of shock. But, beneath that fragile stillness, a tectonic shift was occurring. It wasn't the hot burn of rage, nor the cold grip of panic, but something far more potent and focused, the quiet, unyielding birth of resolve. Her steps were steady as she crossed the living room and approached the door to Daniel's office. It was a space he rarely permitted her to enter anymore, a territory he had subtly, yet firmly, claimed as his own. It had once been their nerve center, a room humming with the energy of a shared dream. It was in this very room they had mapped out the agency's fledgling days. She could almost smell the ghosts of late-night coffee and the electric crackle of shared ambition, their world built on dreams and fueled by cheap takeout, eaten directly from cartons on the floor. But the room that stood before her now was a stranger, sterile, meticulously curated, a stage. It was designed not for collaboration, but for the performance of success, for visitors Daniel desperately needed to impress. And, she now understood with a chilling certainty, it was designed to conceal. Evelyn switched on the desk lamp, summoning a soft amber glow that seemed to absorb the room's coldness. The light spilled across the surface, illuminating a fortress of order. Neatly stacked folders, a drawer whose lock was a blatant declaration of secrets, and Daniel's laptop, positioned with calculated perfection at the very center, the heart of his new, private kingdom. She stood frozen, her breath catching in her throat as she let the memory wash over her, the poisoned fragments of that conversation she was never meant to hear. The words echoed in the silence of her mind, sharp and venomous. Divorce, free soon, the Kensington Project. Each phrase was a crack in the foundation of her life. If Daniel was truly orchestrating this exit, then she wasn't just entitled to the truth, she was owed it. She needed to know what gilded cage he was building for himself, and with what materials he'd stolen from their life. She had to uncover the rot that had been spreading, unseen, behind her back. Sliding into his chair, a seat that once felt like hers too, she began her trespass. She started with the unlocked folders, a methodical search fueled by a desperate, fading hope that she was wrong. The first few documents were a study in the mundane. Client invoices, project, schedules, marketing timelines, the predictable rhythm of the business they had built. But then, tucked away in a folder labeled vendor contracts, with the innocuous addendum pending, her search came to a dead halt. Her fingers brushed against a document that felt different, heavier with implication. It was a contract, authorizing a significant payment that Daniel himself had approved. The recipient was a consulting firm she had never, in all their years, heard of. The address listed was not an office, but a sterile post office box, a dead end. It was located in Cicero, and the entity had no digital footprint, no website, no contact number. There was nothing verifiable, just a name on a page and a destination for their money. Was enormous. A figure so inflated, it felt like a deliberate taunt for the services it claimed to represent. The official words were brand reputation, recovery and narrative redirection, a sterile, corporate poetry for something she was beginning to fear was much uglier. A deep line formed between her brows as her fingers, almost of their own accord, reached for another file. Then, yet another. Out of the chaos of numbers and legalese, a chilling architecture began to reveal itself. A web of payments, meticulously funneled through the anonymity of shell companies. Clients whose names sparked a flicker of recognition, their accounts tethered to the ghosts of scandals she remembered flickering across cable news, buried but not forgotten. She saw invoices that read like contracts with the devil, billing for strategic silence, reputation shielding, a service that amounted to building a fortress of lies around a corrupt king. Her own phone felt cold in her hand as she pulled it from her pocket, a stark portal to the unvarnished truth. She typed the clients' names, and the search results painted a grim mural. Two were inextricably linked to ongoing SEC investigations, their digital footprints screaming guilt. One was the central figure in a notorious public embezzlement case back in Schaumburg. Another had managed to make a harassment suit vanish last year, a quiet settlement that reeked of threats and payoffs, and yet the money kept flowing, a steady stream into the coffers of Daniel's agency. The realization was not a sudden flash but a creeping ice in her veins, a slow, sickening certainty that spread through her chest. Markham and Coors, this wasn't public relations. It was a high-end laundromat for filthy reputations, a place that scrubbed away fraud and sold silence to the highest bidder. The frantic drumming of her own heart became a soundtrack to the discovery, but a strange calm took over her hands, keeping them perfectly steady as she methodically continued her excavation of the truth. There, tucked away beneath a thick stack of polished, sanitized reports, was a single thin envelope that felt heavier than all the others combined. Inside were handwritten notes, penned in Daniel's unmistakable, sharp, slanted script. A jolt went through her. These weren't casual meeting notes. They were blueprints. They were explicit instructions, commands for the meticulous creation of counterfeit realities, concocting false testimonials, burying inconvenient truths beneath a digital landslide, and inflating egos with hollow, manufactured numbers. It was a carefully constructed empire of illusion designed to elevate his clients. This wasn't the drive of an ambitious man, it was the calculated craft of a con artist. A deep, systemic corruption that Daniel had not just participated in, but mastered. His entire ascent, the man she admired, was built upon this rotten foundation. Evelyn sank deeper into the leather of his chair, her breathing a fragile, deliberate rhythm, a desperate attempt to control the chaos erupting within her. A decade of their life together began to unravel in her mind's eye, a tapestry of lies. Each late night he'd framed as dedication was now a shadow of his deceit. Every networking event he'd attended alone, a secret transaction. Every time he'd urged her to stay home, telling her it was boring, was an act of concealment. His mercurial moods, which she had soothed and excused, were not from stress. It wasn't the pressure of success that had weighed on him. It was the crushing gravity of his secrets. Her hand moved with a new, cold purpose. She remembered the small, unassuming box in the lower cabinet, a place for forgotten things. He kept spare keys there, a minor detail that now felt like a seismic clue. Her fingers closed around the cold metal, finding the one that matched the locked drawer. The key turned, the soft click of the mechanism echoing like a gunshot in the silent office. And inside, the truth lay in wait, colder and sharper than she could have imagined. There were more ledgers, accounts bleeding into one another, a web of hidden finances, unexplained transfers that painted a picture of a man she didn't know at all, and a supple leather folio, its contents detailing his greatest prize yet, the impending alliance with the venerable Harrison Kensington. She saw pages filled with projections built on sand, notes scribbled in his familiar hand. He wasn't partnering with the Kensington name, he was planning to consume it. Memos outlined how this union, this final deception, would cement their firm, AY, as a permanent fixture among the city's untouchables. A knot of ice formed in Evelyn's chest, a physical pain accompanying her heart's fracture. She realized with sickening clarity that Daniel wasn't just trying to build a career, impress Ava. A desperate, all-consuming need to meticulously reconstruct his identity. He was burying his former self, and it didn't matter what truths he had to hide, what facts he had to forge, or what history he had to obliterate in the process. With a chillingly steady hand, she retrieved her phone, its cold screen illuminating the quiet resolve in her eyes. The soft click of the shutter became a quiet litany, capturing every document, each incriminating page, each calculated spreadsheet, and every handwritten note that screamed of his deceit. In that moment, she had no clear strategy, no map for the war she had just armed herself for. She didn't know her own next move, but she knew with a cold, clear certainty what the Kensingtons would do if this poison ever reached their carefully curated world. The severing would be absolute, instantaneous. They were a dynasty, powerful beyond measure, but their influence was built upon a reputation that was protected with surgical precision. They would never, ever, tolerate the stain of a man whose entire existence, whose whole carefully constructed career, was a monument to unethical bargains. The realization offered no solace, no sweet taste of revenge. It didn't quiet the frantic bird of anxiety beating against her ribs, but it gave her something she had been starved of, something she thought she had lost forever, a feeling she hadn't known since the ballroom lights had exposed her vulnerability. Control. She gathered the digital evidence, compiling the images into a neat, sterile folder, giving it a name so mundane, so utterly plain, that it was the perfect camouflage for the devastation it held. Then she slid the processed drawer shut. A quiet thud in the silent room killed the lamp, and simply stood. The room plunged into near darkness, her own form a faint, ghostly silhouette reflected in the dark mirror of the window. Daniel's world, she now understood, was nothing more than a fragile house of cards. But she held the truth, the one gust of wind that could bring it all down, and she held it with a stillness that felt both foreign and powerful, like a hidden blade she wasn't yet prepared to wield, but one whose existence gave her a chilling strength, a secret he, in his gilded cage of lies, would never see coming. 2 full days passed, a silent, heavy pause in the narrative of her life, before Evelyn made her first calculated move. She had spent those intervening hours not in panic, but in a state of hyper-focus. The images from the documents she'd captured played on a loop behind her eyes, each one a frame in a film of deceit. The photographs were seared into her memory, and she could still hear every damning syllable, every hushed confession that had drifted through the opulent air of the ballroom. With each passing minute, she felt the cold, hard weight of a terrible clarity cementing itself in the hollow space where her heart used to be. She did not give in to the primal urge to scream. She resisted the impulse to confront Daniel, to shatter their shared reality. She breathed this poison in and told not a single soul. Instead, she waited. She watched him from the kitchen doorway as he prepared to leave the apartment, a portrait of oblivious confidence on that early Monday morning. His movements were tinged with an arrogance she now saw with piercing new eyes. He leaned in and kissed her forehead, a feather-light touch, before he turned to the door. It was a gesture of pure reflex, so devoid of meaning, so utterly empty, it felt as though a ghost had just passed through her. The precise click of the deadbolt was her signal. Evelyn moved directly to her bedroom closet, not to find a disguise, but to assemble her armor. The transformation she required wasn't about drama, it was about erasure. She needed to become someone else entirely. A woman Daniel would never connect to his life. Should a whisper of her actions ever find its way back to him, she pulled her hair back, twisting it into a severe, sleek bun at the nape of her neck. She applied only the barest hint of makeup and selected a sharply fitted black blazer, pairing it with immaculate, tailored trousers. The effect was one of quiet professionalism, of utter neutrality. She was forgettable by design. Her final act before walking out was to slide her true identification into the dark recesses of a dresser drawer, replacing it with the thought ghost of a past life, an alias once created for some forgotten freelance consulting work. Elena Roman, a name that had once felt like a game, a harmless pseudonym collecting dust from a long-finished project. Today, that name was being resurrected for a much darker purpose. The Kensington Model Agency was a monolith of glass and steel, a testament to ambition on the near north side, its transparent walls offering a curated view into a world of manufactured perfection. Inside, the lobby felt less like a room and more like a modern temple, sterile and reverent. Its walls were adorned with silent gods, photographs from global campaigns that screamed success, faces that sold impossible dreams of high fashion and the intoxicating allure of luxury fragrances. These were not mere pictures. They were the spoils of war from 100 different runways, visual testaments to the careers Victoria Kensington had both made and broken. Evelyn paused at the threshold, not to admire, but to calibrate her own soul. She drew a slow, deliberate breath, mastering the flutter of adrenaline in her veins. This wasn't nerves, it was the quiet, focused hum of a predator entering a rival's territory. A polished receptionist offered a practiced, impersonal smile. "Welcome to Kensington. May I help you with an appointment?" The question was a gate, and Evelyn had the key. Yes, Evelyn's voice was a smooth, confident melody, cutting through the sterile air. She presented the name like a carefully crafted jewel. "Elena Roman, I'm expected. I'm here," she continued, her tone implying an arrangement already in place to discuss a collaboration with Mrs. Kensington. It was a masterful lie, wrapped in the language of power. The receptionist's fingers danced across the keyboard, a faint line of confusion creasing her brow. The system, of course, held no such name. "My apologies," she said, already slightly flustered. "I'm not seeing you in the schedule, however," she offered, deferring to Evelyn's unwavering presence. "Mrs. Kensington has a brief window between meetings, if you'd care to have a seat." A slow, knowing smile touched Evelyn's lips. Of course, she had already won the first exchange. Moments later, a shift in the lobby's atmosphere announced an arrival. Victoria Kensington didn't walk, she swept in, her presence a physical force. She was the embodiment of cultivated power, a woman whose authority was so absolute it required no volume, only existence. A severe twist of silver hair crowned her head, a stark contrast to the sharp, intelligent eyes that were already dissecting the room. Her gaze was a scalpel, moving with a precision that missed nothing, assessing everything. "Mrs. Kensington," the receptionist began, her voice now laced with a hint of deference, "this is Miss Roman." The name was offered up for judgment. She was hoping for a moment of your time, to broach the carefully veiled subject of a potential partnership, an opportunity Victoria sensed was more performance than proposition. She extended a coolly polite hand. "I can spare a few minutes," she conceded, a subtle assertion of her own value. They moved toward a quiet, seating area. The stark, modern art on the walls a silent witness to their impending chess match. Evelyn settled opposite her, a study in practiced elegance, her legs crossed, with a poise that felt both natural and meticulously constructed. She was inhabiting a role, and she played it with an almost invisible subtlety. "So, Miss Roman," Victoria began, her voice cutting through the pleasantries, What kind of collaboration are you proposing? Evelyn offered a smile that was soft and perfectly measured, yet it held no real warmth. I consult for smaller, ambitious production teams, the ones seeking to expand their footprint into influencer-focused campaigns. She let that hang in the air for a moment. Several of my clients deeply admire the Kensington brand, specifically for its hard-won reputation, its unimpeachable integrity. The words landed precisely as intended. A flicker of warmth softened Victoria's guarded eyes. Flattery, when used as a surgical tool rather than a blunt instrument, was always effective. Victoria gave a slight nod, a silent invitation to continue. Evelyn then lowered her gaze, a masterful piece of theatre designed to convey deep thought, as if she were weighing the ethics of her next words. Before we would ever approach anything formal, I always insist upon thorough due diligence, especially in the treacherous currents of Chicago's advertising scene. She paused, letting the implication settle. Not every agency, you understand, operates with the same ethical backbone that defines your company. Victoria tilted her head, the hook now firmly set, her intrigue palpable. Is that so? There are firms, Evelyn continued, her voice dropping to a confidential, steady tone, that specialize in, let's call them, unconventional methods, the sort of off-the-book deals that quietly shape a reputation, of strategic concealment and the swift, almost surgical manipulation of public image, words that were honed to pierce the armor of even the most jaded executive. Victoria's entire demeanor shifted, her posture aligning with the sudden, sharp focus of her mind. She held her tongue, a calculated silence that Evelyn had anticipated, had in fact orchestrated this entire conversation to achieve. I am certain a woman of your stature understands just how much, Evelyn's voice softened, a conspiratorial whisper, can be buried beneath the gloss of a perfectly polished brand. She let the implication hang in the air. There is one particular agency, you see, that has been setting off alarms, quiet ones, but persistent, among several of my most trusted associates. I won't traffic in specifics. Idle talk is a currency I do not trade in, but I would urge a certain prudence when considering any new ventures in that particular field. The reputations of Chicago's finest, after all, can be fragile things, especially when they become entangled with the wrong sort of partners. A heavy silence filled the space between them as Victoria absorbed the payload of the message, her eyes dissecting Evelyn not as a guest, but as a complex variable in a high-stakes equation. Her voice was low and even. You are painting with a very broad and very intentional brush. I am, Evelyn conceded without a flicker of hesitation, her honesty a disarming weapon, because it is not my place to trespass on your judgment. I have simply witnessed, more than once, brilliant enterprises being irrevocably tainted by allegiances they forged in haste. A shadow of something new, something cold, moved behind Victoria's carefully composed features. It was a change so minute, a micro-movement of muscle around her eyes, that a lesser observer would have missed it entirely. But to Evelyn, it was as loud as a declaration of war. A seed of carefully cultivated suspicion had taken root in the sterile air of the boardroom. In that moment, Evelyn knew her mission here, in this glass tower, was complete. That was the only insight I wished to share, Evelyn murmured, rising from her chair with a fluid grace. A simple matter of perspective, nothing more. Victoria rose in unison, a mirror of controlled power. Miss Roman, she began, her tone now holding a new resonance. If your perspective should happen to gain any more clarity, you will find my door is always open. Evelyn offered a nod, a gesture of polite deference that concealed a profound triumph. A ghost of a smile touched her lips, a perfectly calibrated mask of professional courtesy. Of course, and I appreciate your time. With that, she dissolved back into the city, leaving the monolithic Kensington building with the same phantom-like quietness with which she had entered. An Arctic Chicago gust clawed at her face, a physical assault on the senses, yet she remained insulated by the cold fire of her own resolve. She moved with a metronomic, deliberate rhythm, not the swagger of victory, nor the tremor of fear, but the pure, chilling focus of a plan in motion. Behind her, in the gilded cage she'd just left, the first toxic spore of doubt had found fertile ground. It was an imperceptible tremor in the bedrock of the Kensington Empire, and Daniel Markham, the man at its epicenter, remained blissfully unaware that the ground beneath his feet had already begun to fracture. An audience with Harrison Kensington was a thing of myth, not easily granted. The man's time was a fortress, his schedule a sacred text, protected with the same ferocity as a national vault, meticulously planned, months ahead by a phalanx of aides. These were not assistants, but psychological gatekeepers, trained to deflect any reality that might disturb the carefully constructed world of one of Chicago's great puppet masters. But when a woman calling herself Elena Roman Evelyn's chosen armor requested a confidential conference, her words were a precisely aimed missile. She spoke of urgent concerns, a phrase expertly crafted to trigger his deepest anxieties, those tied directly to the sanctity of his family's dynastic future. The bait was taken. The reply came not in days, but in less than an hour. A summit was set for the following morning, a testament to the accuracy of her psychological strike. The Kensington patriarch, a creature of habit and control, naturally mandated the terms of engagement, selecting the location himself. It would be a private suite, a sterile and controlled chamber on the highest floor of the Kensington real estate headquarters. This was his domain, a modern-day throne room from which he could dictate the atmosphere, command the sentinels, and, most importantly, own the story. Evelyn had expected nothing less. She had orchestrated her arrival to be early, a subtle assertion of control, her hair a perfect, smooth shield behind her ears. Her expression was a carefully constructed mask of calm, a placid surface over a churning sea of resolve. In her hands, she held not a briefcase, but a slim leather folder, a minimalist vessel for a maximalist truth. It contained the anatomy of Daniel's deceit, the very documents that held the ghost of her camera's flash. The same damning pages she had captured with the meticulous, cold precision of a surgeon just days before. This was evidence born from a betrayal so deep, she had to photograph it to believe it was real. A truth she never imagined herself capable of unearthing, let alone wielding as a weapon. She carried this proof with a chilling tranquility, the weight of it in her hands, feeling less like paper and more like a pivotal piece in a high-stakes game. A queen being moved into position, poised to declare checkmate on a king who didn't yet know he was in peril. The receptionist, oblivious to the gravity of the moment, guided her to an office encased in glass. It was a transparent cage hanging over the indifferent, flowing waters of the Chicago River. Harrison Kensington materialized in the doorway minutes later, his presence filling the room before he even took a step. He was a figure carved from power and legacy, with a mane of silver hair and a frame that spoke of unshakable authority. He entered without a word, his silence a more potent statement than any greeting could have been. The click of the door closing behind him was a sound of finality, sealing them in this crucible of truth. He gestured for Evelyn to stay seated, a silent command that established the hierarchy he was accustomed to. "I was informed," he began, his voice a low baritone that seemed to absorb all other sound, "that you have something for me." His words were precise, a challenge wrapped in professional courtesy, information that requires my immediate attention. He measured her with his gaze, searching for weakness, for motive, for the angle of her play. But Evelyn's eyes met his without a flicker of doubt, a steady, unwavering light against his formidable presence. "I do," she stated, her voice a clear, clean line cutting through the tension. "And I will not waste your time with pleasantries. What I am about to place on this table involves the three foundations of your world." She paused, letting the weight of her words settle. "Your daughter, your business, and a man. A man you have welcomed into both, named Daniel Markham." The impassive mask of Harrison's face did not crack, but a subtle shift occurred behind his eyes. The lazy watchfulness of a lion became the focused, predatory stillness of one that has caught a scent on the wind. He was listening now, truly listening. Evelyn's hands were steady as she opened the folder, revealing the poison within. She slid the first few documents across the gleaming table, the papers whispering against the wood. The cold, hard data of transaction logs, the blatant lies of fabricated invoices, the shadowy network of shell company payments, and finally, the meticulously crafted notes detailing the systematic dismantling of a man's good name. A meticulously planned scheme for laundering money, disguised within the very projections Daniel had drafted for their supposed future. Harrison's gaze moved across the pages, not merely reading, but dissecting. He took his time, a cold dread coiling in his gut with every turn of a page, his jaw muscle clenching into a knot of stone. Then, his eyes landed on the section, detailing the illicit financial transfers, punctuated by Daniel's own arrogant, handwritten notes. In that moment, the world seemed to stop. He ceased, reading, the truth now a searing brand in his mind. His finger found a concealed button beneath the mahogany. The response was immediate. A trusted assistant materialized at the door. Without a word, Harrison extended the sheaf of papers to him, a silent, heavy command passing between them. The explanation was unnecessary. His voice was low, devoid of emotion. I need every detail here confirmed. Run it against everything we have. Cross-reference every transaction, every name, and check it against our most secure internal investigation files. And do it quietly. The assistant, understanding the full gravity, gave a single, sharp nod. He gathered the damning evidence and vanished from the room as silently as he had appeared. Harrison's attention pivoted back to Evelyn, his eyes now sharp, analytical. Where did this come from? The question was a test. It was obtained legally, she stated, her composure a perfect shield. I had authorized access to his office. This wasn't a breach. She let the words settle. No systems were compromised. No property was stolen. It was simply found. A flicker of something. Was it respect? Crossed his face. You are meticulously careful. It was less a compliment than an assessment. In our world, she replied, I have no other choice. A thick silence then fell. It was a silence filled with calculation and shifting allegiances, broken only when the assistant reappeared some 30 minutes later, the professional mask on his face barely concealing the tremor of anxiety in his eyes. He knew he was holding a lit fuse. His voice was strained, tight. Sir, everything checks out. Every last detail. All of it. With a curt wave, Harrison dismissed him, the man's presence no longer required. He leaned back into the plush leather of his chair, the movement slow, deliberate, as he folded his hands. On the polished surface of the desk, a judge contemplating a verdict. Finally, the silence broke with a whisper that carried the weight of an execution. So, Daniel Markham has, not only for weaving a web of deceit around my daughter, but for cynically using our family's reputation as a ladder to a legitimacy he could never earn on his own. A profound silence from Evelyn was his only answer, and in that quiet, Harrison understood it was all the confirmation he needed. A sharp exhale escaped him, a sound born not of shock, but of a deep, personal insult, finally given a name. I felt something was fundamentally wrong, he confessed, the admission tasting like ash. Victoria mentioned, a woman visiting her agency, a woman who came specifically to sow the seeds of doubt. I'm looking at her now, aren't I? Evelyn offered a slow, deliberate nod, an acknowledgement of a necessary, calculated gambit. His tone shifted, the father receding and the CEO emerging. You realize the implications of bringing this to my door, he stated, his voice low and grave. This transcends simple gossip. This is an allegation of criminal enterprise, of money laundering, of meticulously falsified financial records, and of entirely fraudulent business partnerships. If this information leaks to the wrong regulatory bodies before we control the narrative, it could detonate into a catastrophe of very public proportions. I've calculated every risk. Evelyn's voice was steady, cutting through the tension, and I assure you, I am not motivated by a desire for public spectacle. Harrison's eyes narrowed, his assessment of her deepening, recalculating. He saw not a victim, but a strategist. Then what is your objective? What are you truly here to accomplish? Evelyn drew a slow, centering breath, feeling the weight of the moment. She had practiced this speech in the silent theater of her mind, and speaking it now felt like the final, irreversible step into the person she was forced to become. My terms are twofold, she stated. First, Daniel will be held accountable by the full force of the law for the consequences of his actions, and this is not just for the personal betrayal, but for the countless people he has systematically defrauded, of manipulating corporations, and, most damningly, of using your own blood as leverage. Family is nothing more than a ladder to be climbed and discarded. And the second price? Harrison's voice was low, cutting through the charged air. The life I carry, Evelyn stated, her hand instinctively resting on her stomach, a gesture of both protection and proclamation. I have no desire for your wealth. I have no need for your power. What I demand, however, is a future. A financial fortress for my child, one so impenetrable that they will never feel the shrapnel from the world. Daniel is destined to burn down. A flicker of something new moved across Harrison's guarded features. It wasn't the softness of sympathy he felt, but the cold, hard glint of recognition, a respect for a player who had just placed an unbeatable card on the table. And what is this child's connection to Daniel? Markham? He probed, his gaze analytical. 4 weeks, Evelyn answered, the words hanging in the air with the weight of a verdict. In that instant, the very dynamics of the room seemed to bend and reshape around her statement. Harrison leaned forward, the polished mahogany of the table reflecting his now fully engaged posture. You have my undivided attention, he declared, and with it, my unconditional cooperation. Evelyn met his intense gaze, a silent contract passing between them. Then we have a covenant. Harrison gave a single, sharp nod. It was a gesture more binding than any signature on paper, sealing a pact forged in betrayal and desperation. The demolition begins this moment, he affirmed, his voice now that of a strategist. We will architect the narrative. We will dictate the timing. We will own the truth. We will contain the fallout. And I give you my word, your child's future will be sacrosanct. For the first time in what felt like an eternity, Evelyn felt the iron grip on her lungs loosen. She drew a slow, deliberate breath, the air tasting of something she had almost forgotten, hope. The unholy alliance was sealed, and in that quiet office, the first hairline fracture appeared in the foundation of Daniel Markham's meticulously constructed world. The ensuing chaos did not roll in like a predictable tide. It struck Daniel's agency like a contagion in the night, unseen, unheard, but utterly devastating. The aftershock arrived with devastating precision, exactly 3 days after Evelyn's quiet, fateful meeting with Harrison Kensington. Daniel, utterly oblivious to the fuse that had been lit, walked into Markham & Co., expecting a perfectly mundane morning. He anticipated the familiar ritual, strong coffee, routine staff updates, the low, ambitious hum of account managers fine-tuning their pitches. Instead, the moment he stepped through the doors, he walked into an ambush of silence. He found himself in an office, paralyzed by a tension so palpable it felt like a physical weight on his chest. 2 immaculately suited men, their very presence radiating a cold, bureaucratic authority, were from the IRS Criminal Investigation Division, standing like statues of judgment in his lobby. Another pair, equally grim and official, from the Illinois Department of Revenue stood sentinel by the conference room. Their badges were polished and visible, their expressions were meticulously blank, the sterile masks of men who dismantle lives for a living. His own employees seemed to hover in a state of suspended animation near their desks, whispering in tight, fearful clusters, their eyes darting toward him like frightened birds. Mr. Markham, one of the IRS agents said, his voice flat and devoid of emotion as he stepped forward, we're here to address several glaring discrepancies we have found in your reported income, various client accounts, and a number of your vendor contracts. We will need full and unrestricted access to your financial records. Daniel's blood ran cold, his world tilted on its axis. My records? The words felt like sand in his mouth as he stammered them out. There must be some kind of mistake. But his desperate hope was instantly extinguished as the agents were already producing a thick sheaf of documentation, an official audit, warrant, a summons for complete financial disclosure, and formal requests for the immediate release of all bank account histories. There was no mistake here. This was a reckoning. And then, They began to escort him. He was escorted into the glass-walled space that was, until this morning, his own conference room. It was now a command center for strangers, auditors, and forensic accountants, their faces grim and unreadable. One of them, without a word, took his laptop, severing his connection to the world he had built. The paper trails of his career, his financial files, were being systematically gathered like evidence at a crime scene. In the corner, a technician was mirroring his company's server, siphoning the digital soul of his life's work. The efficiency of the dismantling was breathtaking. Within an hour, a bank representative arrived. He carried with him an air of finality, an executioner arriving with a pre-written verdict. The man's announcement was delivered in a tone so practiced and devoid of emotion, it was clearly a script. A chilling, corporate monotone. "Your operating accounts," he stated, "have been frozen, pending the results of the current investigation." The words hung in the air, thick and suffocating. Daniel felt a physical jolt, as if the ground had dropped out from under him. Frozen? The word felt alien. A desperate, frantic logic took over. "You can't," he heard himself say. "My staff, they have families." His mind raced through a litany of obligations. "There's payroll, my vendors, my clients rely on us." "Sir," the man replied, the honorific a thinly veiled dismissal, "the freeze is a legal mandate." The world outside the glass walls seemed to warp and tilt. He was on display in his own collapse. He could see his employees, the people he'd hired and mentored, huddled in anxious groups. He saw the furtive whispers, the nervous glances in his direction, and worse, the ones who deliberately avoided his gaze, as if his misfortune were a contagion they feared catching. Panic was a silent, venomous current, and it was now flowing freely through the veins of his office. By noon, the story had escaped the confines of his building and was tearing through Chicago's tight-knit advertising circles with the speed and ferocity of a wildfire. The narrative was no longer his. It was a beast fueled by whispers, rumors, and dark speculation. The name he had built, Markham and Cohern, was now synonymous with scandal. "IRS agents are all over the place," the gossip mongers said. "They must have found something massive." The advice that followed was always the same. Clients need to get out now, before they get dragged down into the same mess. And in the cold calculus of business, that is precisely what they did. By the end of that single, catastrophic day, 7 of his most significant accounts had already initiated their escape. The termination notices arrived as sterile, impersonal emails, each one a fresh blow. And as the city slept, more messages landed in his inbox, each citing vague concerns about the situation, to weigh the toxic reputational fallout of remaining tethered to his sinking firm. For Daniel, the morning sun didn't bring light, but an electronic firing squad. His inbox was a battlefield strewn with the corpses of dissolving partnerships, each message a fresh betrayal, punctuated by the panicked cries of his staff. And then, a clinical, chilling message from his landlord, a stark reminder that the gilded cage of his corporate lease was no longer a sanctuary, if left unpaid. Yet, through the haze of this sudden collapse, his mind couldn't find the source. He was completely oblivious to the fact that the catalyst for his ruin had been meticulously planted by the one person who had once laid every fragile piece of her soul in his hands. His first instinct was to call Ava, his anchor. The call went unanswered. He sent a text, his heart seizing as the 3 dots, a tiny digital lifeline, pulsed with a potential reply, only to vanish, leaving him in an agonizing silence for minutes. When her response finally came, the words were not her own, but a shield. "My parents want me to create some distance for now. There's too much instability surrounding you. They are insisting I wait until they can resolve this situation." Distance, that single, sterile word cut deeper into Daniel's psyche than any of the financial audits, Ava's parents, the Kensingtons. A new, terrifying narrative began to form in his mind. Were they the architects of this chaos? Had they uncovered a secret he thought was buried forever? Were they putting him through some cruel test? Or was this simply a final, brutal rejection? He tried to call again, a desperate plea, but the line was dead. The call shunted directly to the cold impersonality of voicemail. An animalistic panic took over. He drove to the tarty, Kensington Estate, a fortress of wealth and power, chasing the ghost of Ava, desperate for a single look, a word of reassurance that could stitch his unraveling world back together. He needed clarity. Instead, he met a wall of uniformed indifference. Security refused him entry. The guard simply raised a hand, a gesture not of violence, but of absolute, immovable finality. It was a carefully constructed politeness, a social armor worn to navigate the treacherous currents of the conversation. The guard's voice was a flat, impassive barrier, delivering a line that felt less like a policy and more like a verdict. Mr. Kensington is not entertaining unannounced guests. A raw, desperate, please escaped Daniel's lips, the single word a crack in the carefully constructed facade he wore. He clung to the hope of a simple fix, his voice strained. I have to speak with Ava. This is all just a terrible misunderstanding. I'm just dealing with an audit, he added, the words tasting like ash in his mouth, a feeble attempt to normalize the catastrophe. The guard cut him off, the interruption sharp and absolute. I'm aware, he stated, the two words carrying the weight of complete and total knowledge. And with a chilling finality, he added, Mr. Kensington's instructions were to direct you to your attorney. A chasm of ice opened in Daniel's core, the kind of cold that doesn't just chill the skin but freezes the soul. The thought ricocheted through his mind, a frantic, echoing certainty. Harrison Kensington knew. He knew. And that one truth spiraled into another, more agonizing one. If Harrison knew, then the betrayal had reached Ava. Victoria would know. The entire, impenetrable Kensington circle would know. Their silent judgment already passed. Which meant his entire future, the life he had so painstakingly designed, his coveted partnership, his ascent into their world, his very identity, the meticulously crafted image he had worshipped above all else, was turning to dust, slipping through his fingers faster than his panicked mind could even comprehend. He found himself behind the wheel, the city lights a meaningless blur as a primal panic took control, urging him back to the epicenter of his ruin. But the office that greeted him was a hollow shell of itself, a haunting silence where the hum of ambition once lived. Half the desks were already cleared. The first blow came from his most trusted lieutenant, his senior financial manager, who had abandoned ship with the cold indifference of a single, terse email. His PR coordinator, the very architect of his public image, had resigned without a moment's hesitation. Then came the public execution, initiated by a faceless ghost online. Someone had posted anonymously, on a high-traffic business forum, a single sentence about the federal presence at Markham and Cooper. The digital spark caught fire almost instantly. Within the hour, the story was trending. By the time the afternoon sun bled across the sky, the desperation coiling inside Daniel had tightened into a suffocating, feverish knot. He stood motionless in the growing darkness of his own office, a king surveying a fallen kingdom of one. His gaze was fixed on the closed blinds, a futile barrier against the world outside, his phone a dead weight in his hand. Each breath was a ragged, shallow gasp, the desperate pull of a man drowning miles from shore. This agency, the gleaming monument he had built to his own ambition, the very proof of his existence, was sinking before his very eyes. He numbly answered one call, after another, the voices of lawyers and accountants, a grim chorus orchestrating his demise. The calls were a relentless siege, each one a vendor's voice stretched thin with panic, demanding the money he no longer possessed. Then came the emails, specters of his loyal employees, their typed words trembling with the unspoken question, "Have you destroyed our futures too?" And to this rising chorus of desperation, Daniel could offer only a suffocating, damning silence. He was a king with no kingdom and no answers. As dusk bled across the horizon, the city lights of Chicago began to prick the darkness, a galaxy of oblivious stars. But inside his glass tower, Daniel was a man marooned, his opulent desk feeling less like a throne and more like a tombstone. A film of cold sweat slicked his skin as his mind fractured, replaying every catastrophic mistake, every lie. His hands, trembling with a terror so profound it felt like a physical illness. Every potential future he once saw had collapsed, narrowing into a single, lightless tunnel ahead. The few client calls that still came through were no longer negotiations, but curt, brutal executions of partnerships he had once taken for granted. Each voicemail from his lawyers was a monotone dirge, the legal jargon sounding like the slow, steady shoveling of dirt onto his grave. He was a man trapped in a hurricane, yet he couldn't see the sky, couldn't begin to comprehend who had orchestrated such a perfectly destructive storm against him. The crushing irony, a detail his panicked mind refused to grasp, was that this tempest had not formed in a boardroom, but in a bedroom on the very night. His hubris led him to shatter the trust of the one woman he should have feared most. And now, the same quiet, methodical force that was dismantling his world, piece by insidious piece, was not in some rival's office but standing just beyond the chaos, a calm observer in the storm's eye, witnessing the beautiful, terrible precision of each domino falling exactly as she had willed his own reckoning. She saw the flicker of annoyance in his eyes, a simple question mark that violently twisted into the jagged edges of pure panic. The very instant the two men stated their authority, shattering the last fragile pane of his denial, Mr. Markham, the lead agent's voice was devoid of emotion, a clinical instrument of consequence, broke him. His face, a canvas suddenly washed of all life. A cold dread crept through him, a frantic internal whisper, insisting, This must be some terrible misunderstanding. He searched for the words, a plea to the universe itself. I have done nothing wrong. The lead agent's voice cut through his panic, a placid and unnerving calm. We will afford you every opportunity to clarify the situation, he stated. The words a sterile promise that held no comfort. For now, we need you to come with us. And through it all, Evelyn was a statue of perfect stillness, her expression a carefully constructed mask, unreadable and absolute. No word of defense escaped her lips, no gesture of support was offered. She simply watched, her mind a silent vortex of calculation, as Daniel, in a daze, pulled on a coat, his movements clumsy and disconnected from his thoughts, and followed the agents. From the apartment, a man being led willingly into the gaping maw of his own downfall. The hours that followed stretched into an eternity of silence. For Evelyn, she performed the ritual of making tea, the familiar motions a shield against the tremors of her own heart. She sat at the kitchen table, a queen surveying her conquered territory. She focused on her breathing, each inhale a reinforcement of her resolve, each exhale a release of any lingering pity. It was a masterpiece of control. So, by the time Daniel finally stumbled back through the door, late that evening, he appeared as a man hollowed out from the inside, as if the interrogation had carved a full decade of life from his very soul. An uncontrollable tremor shook his hands as he fumbled with his coat, a physical manifestation of his shattered world. He couldn't bring himself to meet her gaze, instead carving frantic, erratic paths. Across the living room floor, a caged animal desperate to escape its own skin. Someone set me up, he finally breathed, the words thin and brittle in the heavy air. It had to be someone close, he reasoned, his mind racing. Someone who knows the company inside and out. Evelyn slowly lifted her gaze from the porcelain cup, her eyes cool and analytical, but she offered only the crushing weight of her silence. Defeated, Daniel collapsed onto the couch, burying his fingers deep into his hair as if to hold his fractured mind together. They had documents, Evelyn, he choked out, not theories, not circumstantial things. You can just invent things that are impossible to fake. His voice cracked as he listed the nails of his coffin. They had transaction logs, hidden shell, accounts, falsified vendor agreements. They knew everything. He looked up, his eyes pleading. They knew exactly what the IRS was already closing in on. A cold dread washed over him as he recounted the interrogation, his mind replaying their questions about transactions he thought were buried. Secrets no one should have known, he whispered, the sound fragile, a thread about to snap. The realization hit him with the force of a physical blow. Someone sold me out. His eyes, frantic, searched for hers. He wasn't just looking at her. He was peering into her, desperately searching for a flicker of collusion, of deceit. But what he found wasn't accusation. It was a raw, primal fear that mirrored his own. It was the look of a man drowning, exhausted by the struggle, desperate for a hand to pull him from the depths. And in that shared silence, a horrifying clarity began to dawn. The magnificent illusion he had crafted his entire life upon was vanishing like a phantom in the morning light, leaving only the wreckage behind. Dawn broke not with hope, but with the heavy, official knock of returning agents. There were no pleasantries this time, no pretense of a voluntary conversation. The time for choices was over. Daniel Markham, the face of his ruin, stepped forward, his voice devoid of any emotion. "You are under arrest," he stated, the words themselves a cage, on charges of federal tax fraud, wire fraud. Each charge was a nail being hammered into his coffin. Falsification of business records. The list went on, a litany of his sins, and conspiracy to conceal income from regulatory agencies. The formal language echoed in the sudden, suffocating silence of the apartment. It was the sound of a life sentence. Through it all, Evelyn remained a statue by the doorway. Her hands were laced together in front of her, a portrait of unnerving calm amidst the chaos. He turned his gaze to her one last time, a silent, desperate appeal from a condemned man. His eyes begged her to speak, to scream, to shatter this nightmare with a single word of defense, to declare it all a grotesque misunderstanding, a mistake that could be undone. But she offered nothing. Her silence was his answer, and it was absolute. The cold, metallic click of the handcuffs sealed his fate as they led him from the life he knew. He was marched down a corridor bathed in the sterile, unforgiving glare of fluorescent lights. The harsh brightness seemed to strip away his last shred of dignity, exposing him completely. The moment the door clicked shut, a single, shuddering breath escaped Evelyn's lips. It was not the sweet air of relief, nor the sharp taste of victory. It was something far heavier, the profound, soul-crushing weight of a conclusion. An ending she never sought, but one she could no longer deny was her reality. In the quiet of the late afternoon, the silence was shattered by the harsh buzz of her phone on the polished wood. A text had arrived. The name on the screen was Harrison Kensington, and the words that followed were a cold, final verdict. The charges against Daniel were confirmed. A formal indictment was no longer a possibility, but an imminent reality. The message then sketched out a future she had to accept for the man she once loved. He would likely be gone for several years. The text then shifted, a quiet assurance in the midst of the storm, a promise that her child's future, the one innocent life in all this wreckage, would be shielded and secured. Evelyn absorbed the words in a single, breathless pass, her mind processing the finality of it all. She placed the phone face down, a small, deliberate act of closing a chapter. As dusk bled into evening, another call came. It was a formal, unfamiliar number, a professional voice from a Cook County firm, a family law attorney. A chess piece Harrison had already moved into place on her behalf. It had all been arranged with quiet efficiency. "Mrs. Markham," the voice began, the name a painful reminder of an identity she was about to shed. The attorney spoke with practiced calm. "We have gone ahead and prepared the necessary documents." The words hung in the air, heavy and absolute. The divorce petition. It was real now, no longer just a thought. "Given the gravity of the circumstances," the lawyer continued, "it is highly probable the court will expedite the proceedings. Your legal grounds for this are exceptionally strong." The reasons were listed like a clinical diagnosis of a terminal illness: clear, irreconcilable differences, adultery, and the severe financial endangerment he placed you in. Each word was a nail in the coffin of her marriage. On her end, Evelyn listened without a word, her body responding with a slow, deliberate nod of affirmation. It was a gesture for herself, a silent acceptance of the path forward, unseen by the voice on the other end of the line. When the call finally disconnected, she remained seated, a lone figure in the encroaching darkness. The dim living room seemed to hold its breath with her, as she felt the immense, physical weight of it all. The culmination of every lie, every betrayal, settling not just on her mind, but deep into her bones. The searing heat of anger had finally burned itself out. The sharpest edges of her pain had begun to dull. She was no longer just a heartbroken wife. She was something else entirely now. A woman worn down to her very soul, yet anchored by a newfound, unshakable resolve. Her eyes turned to the documents on her screen. She read through the draft, the cold calculus of dividing a life, the division of property and assets. Her gaze lingered on the petition for full legal custody, a mother's fierce, protective declaration. Custody of the child she carried, the one pure thing to come from this union, her singular focus now. She saw the clauses for the restraining orders, a legal wall to be built between her future and his past. They were intrinsically linked to Daniel's criminal charges. Every line, every legal term, stripped away the remaining sentiment. It sharpened her focus into a diamond-hard clarity. This was no longer just a tragic end to her story, about retribution. The very notion had dissolved within her. It was no longer a crusade, to unmask a monster for the world to see. It had become something far more primal, a fight for survival, for the nascent future of her child, for her own fragile peace, a final, clean severing from a man whose memory she had carried like a ghost for far too long. That night, a profound stillness settled over her as she slid the signed divorce papers, a testament to her liberation, into a crisp, sealed envelope, leaving it by the door like a final offering to a past that would soon be collected. She felt a strange sense of calm, a quiet resolve that left no room for tears. Her hand did not tremble as she finally extinguished the lights, casting the room into shadow. She took a steady step towards the bedroom, and the apartment was enveloped in a silence that felt entirely new. It was not the suffocating quiet born of terror, but the serene silence that follows the end of a long, tumultuous chapter. And so, Evelyn Markham moved through the darkness, not as a woman broken by the storm, but as the woman who had finally, decisively, chosen to save herself. The apartment in River North was a sanctuary, modest, bathed in the cleansing glow of sunlight, and filled with a quiet that was a balm to her soul. It was everything Evelyn's spirit craved after weathering the hurricane she had just escaped. Harrison Kensington, a guardian in the periphery, had ensured the acquisition was a ghost in the system, a transaction shielded from prying eyes, its paperwork woven into the legal fortress of a trust, a structure built to safeguard both her newfound anonymity and the security of the child she would soon bring into the world. The space held no echo of opulence, but it was rich in something far more valuable. It was hers, a haven, untouched by the long shadow of Daniel's past or the suffocating ambitions that had once twisted and poisoned their shared existence. In this quiet place, Evelyn began the slow, deliberate process of reassembling her life, one peaceful moment at a time. She learned to breathe again. Her mornings had become a sacred ritual, a solitary walk along the riverfront, with a hand resting protectively over the gentle curve of her belly, a silent vow to the new life within. She would breathe in the crisp, cold Chicago air as if it could physically cleanse the toxins of her recent past. For the first time in an eternity of months, a space was clearing in her mind, a space where thoughts could form without the icy premonition of fear, where she could move without constantly checking the loyalty of her own shadow, and sleep without the phantom echo of Daniel's meticulously crafted deceit. And then, into this fragile sanctuary, a figure from a different, less treacherous chapter of her past made an unexpected appearance. His name was Dr. Lucas Everett, and his re-entry felt like a ripple in the still water she'd so carefully cultivated. He had been her fertility specialist, the calm and steady guide through the emotional labyrinth of her body's betrayals, a quiet anchor in the darkest, most storm-tossed seasons of her long and painful infertility journey. He had witnessed every flicker of hope and every devastating heartbreak, every failed procedure that felt like a personal failing, every single moment she had to dig deep to find the will to remain hopeful. He was also, poignantly, the very first soul to confirm the miracle she now carried, just 4 weeks pregnant, in a moment of pure, untainted joy, before the entire architecture of her life with Daniel had catastrophically unraveled. Lucas had reached out, his name appearing on her screen after he'd heard of her quiet relocation through a mutual colleague. His message was a masterclass in gentle consideration, devoid of any pretense. It was simple. If you ever need any support, at all during the pregnancy, I'm here. There were no hidden requests, No strings attached, just a pure, unburdened offering of care. A familiar wave of caution washed over Evelyn. Trust, in her mind, now felt like a delicate, shattered heirloom. But something in his words felt solid, and so she agreed, suggesting they meet for coffee on the neutral ground near the medical district. When she pushed open the door to the small cafe, the scent of roasted coffee enveloping her, Lucas was already there, rising to his feet to greet her. He looked precisely the same kind, steady eyes, the same gentle demeanor, and an aura of profound ease that seemed to quiet the frantic, anxious hum in her own soul, with a clarity that felt almost sharp. "There's a new strength in your eyes," Lucas observed, his voice a soft murmur that held no judgment, only truth. "I'm trying," she breathed, the words an admission of the monumental effort it took just to exist. And so they talked. The first hour melted into a second, a conversation that felt like a sanctuary. Lucas, with an instinctual wisdom, never once let Daniel's name cross his lips, understanding that some wounds couldn't bear the touch of inquiry, especially from a world she wasn't ready to let back in. Instead, his questions were anchors to the present moment. He asked about the quality of her sleep, the food that nourished her and the child, the small, invisible structures of support she was building around herself. He spoke to her not as a project or a puzzle, but as a person, his concern radiating from a place of pure empathy, untainted by the shadow of duty or the whisper of personal gain. His care stemmed from a memory, a fleeting moment when he had witnessed her at her most broken, and in that fragile state, he had glimpsed a profound resilience, a core of steel she herself was completely blind to. From that day forward, he wove himself into the fabric of her healing, becoming a quiet, constant presence. He was the one who navigated the treacherous winter roads, ensuring she reached her prenatal appointments safely when the world outside was slick with ice. He was the one who helped her decipher the cryptic instructions for a baby crib, his quiet laughter filling her small apartment, turning a moment of potential frustration into a shared, simple joy when the diagrams made no earthly sense. He would leave offerings of fresh fruit by her door, a silent acknowledgement of the tacit, relentless waves of morning sickness that ambushed her, and on the nights when the past reared up, cloaking her in a sudden, suffocating fear, he would simply sit with her, his silent companionship, a powerful antidote to the isolating terror. There were no grand pronouncements, no hurried advances, no attempts to cross boundaries she was still drawing. There was only his presence, a slow, gentle force that allowed her soul to begin its meticulous rebuilding. As the birth of her child drew near, a new reality dawned on her. Evelyn realized she was leaning on the quiet strength of Lucas, relying on him far more than she ever anticipated, yet it was a support that never once threatened to suffocate her fragile, emerging independence. He was a buttress, not a cage. He became her anchor, a silent, unshakable presence in the storm of her mind, particularly when the ghosts of her past with Daniel haunted the deepest hours of the Daffer night. So when the first wave of labor seized her, it was instinct, not thought, that made her call his name. Lucas, a blur of motion and quiet resolve, materialized at the hospital in what felt like seconds, a bulwark against the rising tide of her panic, breathing with her through each cresting wave of pain, through every tremor of a terror she couldn't name, through every ragged, exhausted gasp for air. His hand was a lifeline in hers as the clinical ballet of the medical plaque. Teams swirled around them with a practiced calm. "You're safe," he murmured, his voice a low, steady current. "I am right here. You are never going to be alone again." And when Nicholas finally made his way into the world, a breathtaking cry piercing the sterile air, he was a small, fragile miracle with the same profound, quiet eyes as his mother. In that moment, it was Lucas, who reached out first, his hand gently settling on the newborn's tiny back, a gesture of profound welcome, as Evelyn's own strength gave way to a flood of quiet, cathartic tears. This wasn't the future she had ever envisioned, but a part of her soul knew it was the future she was always meant to find. As the weeks melted into a blur of new motherhood, Lucas was a constant, his presence a source of unspoken comfort, always radiating that same respectful, gentle warmth. He learned the rhythm of her new life, helping with bottle preparations, mastering the art of the diaper change with an unexpected grace, and taking the watch beside her through the long, moonlit vigils when Nicholas refused the solace of sleep. The bond between them solidified, not in the fire of grand, sweeping confessions, but in the quiet, sacred space created by 1,000 small, consistent acts of unwavering care. Meanwhile, far from this new world of fragile beginnings, Daniel Markham's destiny was being written in hushed, sterile rooms. After weeks of calculated back and forth, he finally surrendered, accepting a plea deal. A plea deal brought reduced charges, the promise of a shorter sentence, but it was a gilded cage nonetheless. He would still be confined by the cold reality of federal prison time, and in a way, he already was. He never discovered the identity of the person who had delivered the damning evidence against him. A phantom hand had orchestrated his downfall, and he remained oblivious to how the Kensingtons, with their vast power, had unearthed every single one of his transgressions. He never even suspected the deepest truth of all, the one that mattered most, that Evelyn had walked away from the wreckage of their lives carrying a new one inside her, pregnant with his child. His ego, even in defeat, never allowed him to ask, and so he never knew. For her part, Evelyn never offered the truth, not out of spite, but out of a fierce, protective instinct. The new life she was meticulously building wasn't founded on the bitter soil of vengeance. It was a sanctuary, built on the bedrock of escape, the high walls of protection, and the fertile ground of renewal. In her mind, Daniel belonged to a former self, a ghost from a life that felt like another person's story. He was a chapter she had not just closed, but ripped out, locked away, and sealed with finality. Then, on a crisp spring morning, when the air itself felt like a fresh start, a new narrative began. Lucas arrived, not with grand gestures, but with the quiet consistency of fresh coffee and a small, hopeful bouquet of tulips, their colors a stark, beautiful contrast to her muted past. Evelyn opened the door to him, a new version of herself. Nicholas was nestled in her arm, a warm, breathing weight, half-lidded and content. "You're early," she said, and for the first time in a long time, her smile reached her eyes without a shadow of fear behind it. "I like seeing you both start the day," he replied, his voice soft, not with pity, but with a quiet reverence. In that simple exchange, something profound settled between them. A silent current passed through the space. It wasn't a dramatic, earth-shattering moment. There was no thunder, no sudden revelation. It was something far more potent and far more real. A quiet, undeniable recognition of a beginning. A mutual understanding that a new foundation was being laid, brick by gentle brick. Evelyn stepped aside, a simple physical movement that symbolized a monumental internal shift, and let him in. Her life, a mosaic once shattered into 1,000 sharp pieces, had been painstakingly reassembled. It had settled into something gentle, something that felt, for the first time, truly safe. It was a life defined by the fierce, tender rhythms of motherhood, the slow, patient work of healing, and the first warm, honest companionship she had ever truly allowed herself to know. A connection without pretense. As if sensing the shift in the atmosphere, Nicholas stirred in her arms, letting out a tiny, contented sigh. Evelyn instinctively kissed his forehead, a silent vow of protection and love. This right here, this moment, was her peace, her hard-won renewal, the life she had not been given, but had bravely built for herself. The internal storm quieted, and in the stillness that followed, a single path was irrevocably chosen.